Well, hi everybody, and welcome to the Betty Eats podcast, where we talk about real recipes put together by real people, and we learn how to tell good recipes from not so great ones. And today on the program, we have Kerry Faber. She is a trained chef. She is a professional recipe tester and a recipe developer. She has her own newsletter on Substack. And I have gotten to know Kerry over the past few months, and I'm very excited to talk to you today. So welcome to the program, Kerry.
Thanks. I'm so
Yeah,
excited to be here too, Beth.
yeah. Well, I have to say something that really intrigued me when I was looking just over your newsletter and also, interacting with you on the Substack platform is I thought I have never actually thought about recipe testers before. And so I thought maybe we could start with that of like, what does a recipe tester do and how did you start doing this?
Yeah, actually, maybe I'll start with how I got into it, and then
Yes,
I'll
yes, yes,
tell
yes, that's
you
great.
about what I do. Yeah, back in 2016, I was working a successful marketing job and was raising two young kids and decided that I wanted to go to culinary school. And yeah, I quit my job. I went back to school full time, and it was actually an incredible experience. As part of school to graduate, I had to do an externship, which you could go work in a restaurant or for a caterer or a private chef, but I decided to take a job with Good Housekeeping working in their test kitchen. And so that lasted about maybe 4 months. And I really connected with the food director there. And she, in 2017, ended up moving to a new job, which was developing content for this company who worked on, they developed in-store magazines for different grocery chains in the Northeastern US. So she was looking at the time for at-home recipe testers, and she reached out to me. And so I started this. I've been doing it now for about 7, 8 years, and that's really how I got into it. Yeah. So as for a recipe tester, basically what you do is you develop recipes that are developed by recipe developers and make sure that they work. So I'm responsible for taking the recipe, reading through it from start to finish, making sure I actually then make the recipe. I record things like the prep times, the cook times, how many servings a recipe makes. Sometimes I've even asked to do more complex volume measurements. So like for things like soups or stews, I have to figure out how much they yield so that you can determine serving sizes or how many servings for something. And then ultimately I have to taste it and say, does this taste good? What does it taste like? If there's any sort of textural or consistency things that are worth noting. So yeah, so that's basically what I do. And then if there are any issues with the recipe, when I'm making it, I take notes on that and then I'll make suggestions for how to improve it or make it better. So sometimes those suggestions are pretty simple, like if they forget to say season with salt or something like that, I'll give that kind of note. Other times, if like I'm making cookies, I'll look for, if it's helpful to add like a visual cue for what they look like when they're done, that's a kind of note that I'll provide. But then sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated. Like I was actually doing a 3-layer cake last week, and it was made in 6-inch cake pans. It was a 3-layer cake, 3 6-inch cake pans. The layers ended up cooking up really, or baking up very, very tall. So when I was going to frost the cake and stacking the layers on top of each other, it was super wobbly and unstable. So I know it was not
Oh
fun.
no.
So I made a suggestion, actually a couple of suggestions. I said, well, either you can just cut off the rounded tops of the cakes so that they have that flat surface to be able to stack them more stably. And then I said another thing you could think about too is like, maybe you take an 8-inch cake pan instead of a 6-inch. With the same amount of batter, it obviously spreads out a little bit more, so you have thinner layers, and then those also by stacking would maybe be a little bit more successful. Those are the kinds of things that I suggest and do. One other thing is I usually am the first person to test the recipes that I test. They come right from the developer to me, but there are times where, let's say, a recipe has failed a couple of times and they've reworked it and they want me to try it out one more time just to make sure it works. I'll do those as well. And then actually, when I was at Good Housekeeping, I was always usually like the third or fourth test of a recipe. So let's say like the first few times they made the recipes on a gas stove, they would ask me to then try it on electric to see, how it tested, if there were any variabilities in the times or in the end results. And so, yeah, so that's basically all the fun of what I do as a recipe tester.
You bring up a really good point. I didn't think about gas versus electric. That could
Mhm.
actually be a big deal in certain recipes. Like I have electric, but
Mhm.
but I can imagine on gas, things, I don't know, do they run hotter on gas? I'm not really sure. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
things heat up a lot quicker.
Mm,
And just even the amount of heat that the pan conducts is different. So I would always, when I was testing on the electric stove, usually there was a pretty big range in the timing that they would provide in the recipes because a gas stove, you might do it in, cook something to doneness in 5 minutes, but on an electric stove, it might be 8 minutes. So it is definitely a big factor.
yeah. Yeah, I didn't think about that. That is a really good point. And there are, I don't know, in the US it might be split 50-50. I don't really know.
I don't know. I know they're trying to move away from gas stoves now too, at least in
Hmm.
my area. And so I know like induction is becoming more popular. And so
Yeah.
it's going to be interesting to see how things evolve with that.
Yeah, yeah, that is such an interesting, I think the average person just doesn't think about recipe testing and how important that is. And, especially now you've seen the rise of AI recipes, AI created recipes, and
Mhm.
people just reposting. I have certain friends that just repost like whatever kind of, I can tell it's an AI recipe, but they don't know that. And I just think, no, don't post that.
Oh,
That's
I
not tested.
know. It's
But
so crazy.
yeah,
But as a recipe tester, I definitely am able to really spot what makes a recipe good and less good. I have definite red flags that go up when I see certain things, and I'm like, oh, I mean,
yeah,
what are they even thinking?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about those now because I always like to
Okay.
talk about like because I think people don't know if you've cooked a long time. I think there are certain things that you look for, but especially with your training and with your experience, what are red flags? What do you look for?
So, I would say like a good recipe is one that's really clear. It's well organized and, well written and easy to follow. The instructions are really easy to follow. I would say on the flip side, a bad recipe is one that's poorly written, where you see a lot of like typos, inconsistencies, things like that, which are really clear signs that the recipe has been pretty hastily put together or really hasn't been tested. I just, as an example, a couple weeks ago made a ramp cream cheese, which I ended up going online just to get a little inspiration from recipes. So I was Googling and I found this one recipe that had you take a cold brick of cream cheese, a cold block, add a little sour cream to it, and then it said, whip that by hand with till you get a light and fluffy consistency with a wooden spoon. And I'm thinking, I don't care how strong you might be, like nobody is easily or comfortably taking a cold cream cheese and whipping it into a fluffy consistency by
No.
hand. I mean, ultimately, I was like, I'm going to soften my cream cheese. I'm going to put it in the stand mixer and whip it up. But when you see recipes like that, it just definitely makes you think twice about like, did they even make this recipe one time? It's crazy. And so another thing just around like the being, having really clear and well-written recipes. I actually did a little bit of like AI testing when I knew that we were going to speak. And because honestly, I mean, I know it's crazy and I know there are so many of these AI generated recipes out there, but that's just not something I've really explored. And I really have no reason to because I, write my own recipes. But I thought, let me just check it out and see what kinds of things I can generate with it. So I had just gotten back from Hawaii and I had macadamia nuts on the brain for some reason. And I was like, let me do a macadamia nut fruit salad, which I don't even know where that came from, but I figured it would give me like a very basic recipe back. So one of the things I spotted right away was that it listed in the ingredients 1 cup of toasted and chopped macadamia nuts. And then in the instructions, and asked you to go ahead and toast and chop the macadamia nuts, which again, when you see that redundancy between the instructions, the ingredients and the instructions, that's like a definite red flag for me that just the recipe isn't very well written. It's the same thing like if you say have a recipe that asks as an ingredient for cooked rice, you're not going to put the step of actually cooking the rice in the recipe, if that makes sense. So it's like little inconsistencies like that you can spot that, and that I spot that I immediately know that this isn't maybe the most quality of a recipe. So that's one big thing I would say. Another thing is I find that good recipes have really easy to find and accessible ingredients for people. Love actually making recipes with new ingredients and trying new flavors and all of that. It's one of the most fun things about cooking, but if I'm asked to, say, use a tablespoon of some ingredient that I can't find anywhere, I have to get it on Amazon for like $15, and I know I'm never going to use this ingredient ever again, that kind of thing is a little bit, less fun. So I'd say definitely just having ingredients that are easy for people to find and to get that, that they'll use is a definite plus of a good recipe. And I guess on the flip side, a bad recipe maybe is doing some things that are a little more and asking for things that are a little bit more obscure. And then I would say another really big thing for me personally that I've really, especially in this world now of all these online recipes, is it's so important to look at the reviews and the ratings of a recipe when they have them available. And I'd say a lot of AI, obviously, you don't have that. But, or I guess if you are going to someone's site and they are putting up recipes and they're allowing for reviews and ratings, then, that's how you're getting a sense. But if I see a recipe that has less than 4 stars or ideally 5 stars, I'm definitely digging into the comments to really see what, why they're not giving it a perfect score. It raises that little flag. And when you dig into the recipes and I should say the comments, it's so helpful. People will, immediately call out if there's something that they didn't like or if there's a typo in the recipe, which hopefully whoever authored that recipe fixes it really quickly since it's online. But, and oftentimes you'll even see people who will give suggestions on how to fix it, which is great. So I find a lot of value in really digging into that. And even if there aren't comments on something, at least knowing what some of the issues are, you can then think about, all right, well, if I'm going to make this, what are the adjustments that I would make to the recipe to get a better result? And I'll be honest with you, if I see a recipe that has poor ratings and let's say it doesn't have any kind of comments on it, I'll probably just skip it over and just try to find something else similar that does have, better reviews on it. So that's I would say another really big thing that I sort of use to discern what a good recipe versus a bad one is. And then, another thing I would say is, with recipes that are great that offer like substitutions and variations on things, I find that those recipes tend to be ones that are a little bit more thought out and that they probably have been tested a few times. It's obviously also just wonderful for with all, people's dietary restrictions or just eating preferences or whatever it may be. It's great to be able to make adjustments to recipes, and actually successful recipes are ones that you are able to make variations to and still get a really great end result and not sacrifice taste or flavor or whatever. So that's actually, as a recipe developer, something that I'm super into is offering up substitutions and things like that. Because, it's just helpful for people. And the one thing I will say though is like if I'm doing a baking, something that I'm baking, won't offer a substitution unless because it's obviously a little more exact and precise. So I won't offer a substitution unless I am 100% sure that the recipe is going to work. And I ideally, if I do provide one, I go and I test it and I make sure that it works. I did like a matcha donut recipe a couple months ago. And I actually went and tested gluten-free and vegan versions and felt confident to offer those up because I had tried them and I knew they were still as great as the original was. So it's not, the one thing I will say about the substitution thing, it's not that a bad recipe doesn't have substitutions, but I think you can trust, I think, recipes that do tend to offer, and sort of have more layers to them like that. They give me a little bit more confidence that they've been thought out. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the basic things. I mean, the one thing I would also just say that's so key is to trust your gut. I know it seems so, but I think it's surprising. A lot of people assume or just have that mentality that the recipe is always right, but it's not. And so if something feels a little off, go ahead. It probably is off, and if you want to make an adjustment to something like to suit your preferences or whatever, go ahead and make that adjustment. It really is. There's a lot of room within recipes to do that. It most likely is. And that's why I also always tell people, read the recipe through from start to finish and in advance, because if there are these issues or potential things that, might not be right, you can kind of catch those up front and then have time to make adjustments if you need to.
Yeah, yeah, and that brings up a good point, I think, too, is a lot of times, you sort of feel bad of like, oh, I didn't make it exactly like the recipe, but, I always think I'm not married to this recipe. I mean, I'm the one eating it, so.
Yes, it's like, totally. You have to make it for you and, for the people that you're making it for. And yeah,
Yeah,
it's like, I mean, like, I can't even tell you how many times I will look at something and say, like, why didn't they add salt to this? Or, some basic thing like that. Or, this seems very one note, like it needs a little bit of acid in it, or like a hit of lemon juice or whatever it might be. If it feels right to you, you should do it and you
yeah,
learn from it. If it doesn't work, if it still fails or whatever, and doesn't taste as good, you
yeah,
learn from it and that's all you can ask.
yeah, yeah, and it's still edible. I mean, most of the time.
Yes, most of the time. It's so funny because I actually was recently talking with someone who told me that they made these crab bombs, which actually sounded delicious. But they said that on the recipe it said it called for 2 tablespoons of Old Bay seasoning, and they were like, "That seems like a lot of Old Bay." But
Yeah,
they, so they had that little moment, but then they went ahead and made it as the recipe said, and they said like all I could taste was this Old Bay seasoning, and it overpowered all this delicious crab meat. And I was like, and like it was after that I actually went online and I just quickly Googled crab bombs and looked, and most of the recipes had like 1 to 2 teaspoons. So that's actually something else you can do is like do a little research, just like gut check it, to make sure it comes out okay. I saw that and I was like, clearly that was a typo in the
yeah,
recipe. But,
yeah,
I mean, I think whether you're a seasoned cook or not, like everyone, a lot of people have good instincts for this stuff. And if it seems like too much, it probably is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And at the end of the day, I mean, we're adults, so we can do what we want with the recipe. It's like,
That's darn
I don't want to
right.
put that in.
Nope. And well, I mean, I actually do that all the time too. I was just, I will make my own little variations to things based on things I like and don't like. I'm getting better. I'm very weird. I like cooked tomatoes, but I don't like raw tomatoes. I used to leave raw tomatoes out of recipes altogether, but now my kids actually like them. So I'm graciously incorporating them back into foods. But as the person in charge of the meal, you can do whatever the heck you want. You can put it in, leave it out. It's your call at the end of the day.
Yeah, very true. Speaking of your kids, I really loved your article the other day. You were talking about just raising kids to have a broader palate and, encouraging them to try things. And I thought that was such a great resource for parents. I would really love to put that in the show notes just as a link for people to, you know, to have access to. But do you want to just talk a little bit maybe about, raising kids and just so that they're not always eating chicken nuggets at every meal, just
Yeah.
maybe some highlights. Do you mind talking
No,
about
no,
that?
not at all.
It was
And
such a
thank
good
you.
article.
It was a very personal article. And, it's honestly one of those that, I mean, it's such a complicated topic, just eating preferences and trying to raise kids to be more adventurous eaters. And so I was definitely very like trying to be very sensitive and delicate, but also really coming from a place of like things that I had felt had worked for me and being just very honest and open. But, at the same time, acknowledging that everyone's kids are different and are going to have a different journey. But, with the hope ultimately that they find something that works, for them. Or ultimately, at the end of the day, the great thing is as kids get older, their eating preferences evolve. And so, if you can't get them to eat this thing now, don't worry. One day, I'm sure their palate will be broader and they'll like a lot more foods. But, for me, I would say the biggest thing that I found was just introducing all kinds of different foods regularly and often. I grew up in a house with just surrounded by my parents actually both love to cook and eat. And I was exposed to all kinds of different foods and cuisines growing up throughout my childhood. And so for me, it was really important to do the same for my kids, to really expose them to all kinds of different things. And I knew that some things would stick and other things wouldn't. But for the things that didn't stick, it's also important to be persistent and, try to reintroduce them later just because, and I'm a marketer by trade, as I had mentioned. So it's really all about how you package things too, right? I would like, maybe I made something one way and it failed. I'm like, well, I'll give it some time and some space so they kind of forget about that experience. And then I'm going to reintroduce it later in a different way that maybe they'll like find is a lot more fun, or maybe they won't even realize it's the same food. So that's really been the key for me is just the variation and the persistence. And then also just trying to like cook things in a really flavorful way to make those foods really shine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I know. I think we all grew up with like Brussels sprouts being like boiled.
Oh,
Like nobody likes
yes,
that. And
the worst.
it just, I know it's, I think that preparation and the seasoning, like you talked about, like I don't think I ever liked Brussels sprouts until I was an adult and somebody served them to me and they were roasted. And I was like, are these the
Oh
same
my
vegetable?
gosh. That is how I introduced Brussels sprouts to my kids, actually, was roasted because I had, like you, had a very similar experience of just having these mushy, soggy, flavorless little mini cabbages. They were terrible. And, it was the same thing with asparagus, actually, for me. I hated asparagus as a kid because I think I just always ate it really either undercooked or overcooked. So it was too crunchy or too soggy. And then I ended up having this like I think when I was a teenager, like this perfectly steamed asparagus with this really delicious soy vinaigrette dressing on it. And I mean,
Oh,
that was it.
yum.
I was like
Wow.
converted. I love asparagus now. So, I mean, it definitely, there's so much in the preparation that matters.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about going to culinary school. You kind of touched on that a
Yeah.
little bit earlier. So, what was kind of the tipping point? You said you worked in marketing.
Mhm.
Why did you decide, okay, I'm going to go for it? What was the key moment there? What made
Yeah.
you decide that?
So, I mean, I've been super passionate about food since I mentioned that I grew up with in a household where my parents were always cooking, and I actually started to get really into baking. When I was 4 years old, or 4 or 5, I was given this Holly Hobby bake oven, which I don't know if you remember those, but it's a throwback. But I got this bake oven and it had a little light bulb in it actually that was its heat source. And I used to make these little adorable cakes and pies in it. It was so much fun. So that's kind of, I think, what initially kind of, when the baking bug, I guess, bit me. And then when I was a teenager, I just started making sweet treats all the time. I was baking like Toll House cookies and peanut butter Rice Krispie treats. And oh, I had this really delicious, it was a white chocolate bundt cake that I made a number of times. It was from a recipe from Debbie Fields. You remember from Mrs. Fields cookies?
Yeah.
And so she had this amazing recipe for this white chocolate bundt cake with this really dreamy glaze on top. It was just delicious. And I made that a bunch of times too. And so I really became very passionate as a teen about baking. And then as I started to move into college, I started cooking more, cooking for myself and cooking for my friends. And my passion just really, I think, escalated from there. So I, as luck would have it, I fell into a great marketing job right out of college and I was, doing that. But I just always was still baking and cooking and loving it. And, back when I was growing up or, even in those kind of early years of my 20s, you didn't have all of these food opportunities like the celebrity chefs wasn't a thing and, blogs didn't exist. And so the pathway to food was much more limited. So I think I had reserved it as a hobby. But then, I got to this point where I was liking my job in marketing, but I wasn't super passionate about it. And I just started thinking more like I'm always cooking and baking for fun. And so how do I do this, on a more regular, how do I kind of formalize this and turn it into something more? And so I think that's when I decided and had always kind of in the back of my head thought culinary school would be really amazing to hone my skills and, really, I think, take my skill to the next level just in terms of becoming a more intuitive and creative cook. And so that's what led me to school. Yeah, it was such a great experience. I was a bit older than a number of my classmates, but I, was able to, it was kind of funny. I sort of took on this like motherly kind of thing with some of the kids in the class and they would look up to me and come to me for advice and whatever. And it was very cute. But culinary school was definitely that experience for me that just really opened me up to all of the possibility of cooking and made me a lot more free and confident in the kitchen. And then obviously then led to all of these other opportunities like the recipe testing and development.
Yeah. When I feel like, you said that you were one of the older students, I feel like you kind of came with an advantage though, because you had already applied, you had already had to cook in the real world for a family, for yourself. And, I think sometimes when, and not that this is bad, but I think a lot of times, the 20-year-old that's in culinary school, it's like, well, you haven't had to like actually put dinner on the table at 5 o'clock and, for several years. So it seems like
Yeah.
you came with a little bit of practical app knowledge. So
Yeah, no, absolutely true. I mean, my knife skills were atrocious, but before school.
mine still are.
But other than that, yes, I think the other thing, that was kind of interesting was, I found that I was also able to kind of keep being a little more mature and older, like a level head in the kitchen, because it obviously things can get really stressful. And, we would have these tests in culinary school where we'd have to like, they'd give us a couple ingredients and say, make this thing on the spot, like whatever you want to make. And I know it was like a little reality show, cooking reality show moment, but I, found that I was able to work well under pressure, maybe a little bit better than some of my younger classmates just from, going through, and stressful experiences, raising kids. I don't know what it was, but I was able to keep my cool in a way that I think also gave me a little bit of that edge.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's really interesting. So after culinary school, you were able to parlay that into recipe testing and developing, because I know you develop your own recipes as well. And so that really kind of
Yeah.
gave you like another level of foundation almost for that. So
Yeah, no, for sure.
yeah.
And the recipe developing actually, I only started doing in the last couple years, which, I'm surprised I hadn't started it sooner. I think the recipe testing gave me a lot of confidence and understanding of like the fundamentals of building a really good recipe. That then gave me the confidence in myself to really like, hey, I should start making my own recipes too. Like, what am I doing? I can make this better. I can do, something different and fun with this. And so, yeah, I do really appreciate how culinary school helped me kind of launch me into that.
Yeah. Yeah. So now that you are developing your own recipes, do you find just inspiration, from your kids, like you said, making things in a way that are going to appeal to them, or where I'm sure that could be an inspiration, but
Mhm.
what else inspires you when you are developing a recipe?
So I think one of the biggest things for me, which I believe I think you've said this too, like when I travel, I am incredibly inspired by the foods
Yeah.
that I eat when I travel. I think that's for a lot of people. So, when I was recently in Hawaii, as you know, I discovered this amazing restaurant in Kauai called Break and Feast, and they had these pancakes that banana pancakes that were otherworldly, just really thick and fluffy and cake-like in texture, with bananas and peanut butter chips and candied macadamia nuts and salted whipped honey butter on top. I mean, just incredible. So I obviously had the best time eating them. But then when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about them. And so I'm like, I need to try to make this myself. And so I spent a couple weeks in the kitchen actually coming up with a recipe that I put into my Substack for banana pancakes that came pretty close to the amazing pancakes I had there. So that's definitely when I find foods from my travel is a huge source of inspiration. Another thing is really when I have these foods that I grew up with that I really loved. And so I take some of those childhood favorites and I try to modernize them a bit, maybe update them with different and new flavors to kind of make them my own. So that's another thing that really inspires me. And then just, things in general that I love to eat, like certain things a lot. And I haven't found a recipe that exactly does them in a certain way. And I'm like, let me try to do this myself and see how it comes out. And it's crazy. I have this like really long list of ideas on my phone that just keeps growing and growing. And so, I've been tapping into that when I'm like, I want to make something. What should I make? And I go through that list and, I'm trying to chip away. But yeah, I think those are the biggest inspirations for me.
That's interesting. Rebecca Blackwell of Let's Get Lost
Uh-huh.
also keeps a list, I think on her phone too, of she'll think of certain flavor combinations or just something will come into her head. And I know she said she's just got like this list of like, okay, I need to like make that. And so it's just like you said, chipping
Yeah,
away at like, okay, I really want to, get on that one. So
it's so
yeah.
funny because I'm exactly the same way. And like, I come up with ideas at the most random times. Like, I vividly remember I was like in the ocean one time, like swimming, and I had this idea for this like buffalo chicken rice, or I don't even, but it's just like you suddenly are like, it just comes to you in the most random of places, in the shower or whatever it may be, when you're just like deep in thought, creative thought or whatever. But yeah, that's how it happens for me as well.
Yeah. I know there's probably a name for that phenomena of like, when you're vacuuming or like you said, in a pool and suddenly you get this creative
Yeah.
spark.
Your best ideas come at the most random times for sure.
Yeah, very true. Well, you are going to share a recipe with listeners, and so I will put a link to that. But what is the recipe, the tried and true recipe that you're going to share?
So I'm excited to share my coconut almond chocolate chip cookies. They are based on, yes, one of my favorite candy bars of my childhood, the Almond Joy. It's a recipe that I'm super proud of. I put a lot of time into developing and testing it, and I'm a little biased, but it's really delicious. It has toasted almonds and sweetened flake coconut and chocolate chips. And I put it out in my Substack a few months ago, but I had a subscriber tell me that she just makes tons and tons of cookies and that this was the best cookie she'd ever made in her entire life. And she put it in all caps, and it was
Wow.
obviously the ultimate compliment. But if you do try them, or if anybody watching this tries them, they're really, really delicious. And I hope you love them as much as I do.
They sound amazing. I could have that with coffee right now. That sounds so good.
Yes, they're perfect with a cup of coffee and iced coffee, whatever you like. But yes, they're
Yeah.
wonderful.
Well, where can people find you online? You mentioned your Substack, and so I will
Yes.
put a link to that. But what is your Substack called?
It's called Dish Lister.
Okay. And where else are you on Instagram?
I am. I'm on Instagram as well, also under Dish Lister. And then I actually have links on my Substack to my Instagram as well as my Shop My page. My Substack Dish Lister is actually based on, because I have for many, many years have been giving recommendations to all of my friends and family and, for things that I'm making and favorite recipes and restaurants I'm loving that they want to try or whatever it may be. So, Dish Lister was kind of my way of sharing my recommendations that have always from my friends and family been really well received. And, I thought this would be a really fun way to and actually more efficient way of kind of sharing my recommendations and things I love on a broader scale. It just, it makes me really happy to be able to share recommendations and recipes that make people happy. So yeah, so that's where I am. I'm on Substack, but then on Instagram as well, and developing kind of a page of my favorites on Shop My.
That's awesome. I'll put links to all of that in the show notes. I know, and I think those personal recommendations, like you said, that's really what we're all looking for. Whether it's a restaurant or a recipe or, even like a kitchen tip or technique, it's like, when you know someone that has used that or been there or eaten there or loved it, that's like the highest thing. It's like Yelp is great, but like you said, that personal recommendation is really what we're all looking for.
Yeah, no, I know. And it's, like I said, I'm actually pretty discerning. I won't make a recommendation unless, I've tried it a number of times, or, if it was like a restaurant, it has to be like really amazing experience. Like I like to be selective about what I recommend. And yeah, at the end of the day, it is wonderful when, you're able to share some of that with other people and then they have a really great experience too. There's honestly nothing better than that for
Yeah.
me,
Yeah,
which is
I
why I
agree.
do this.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, Carrie, for being on today. I so appreciate your time, and I feel like I've learned
Yeah.
so much just about the whole recipe testing process and also more about you. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great
Yeah,
to meet you
yeah, thank you.
finally in person.